Good day. Today is Thursday, 18th December 2025, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button if once you have watched this program, you like what you've heard and you decide that you want to indicate that fact. Now, with that, let me now turn to the situation, the news today, and I think the most important news continues to revolve around the situation concerning Ukraine. And specifically, we have underway, even as I am making this program, a meeting in Brussels. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, has apparently said that the meeting will not end until some sort of agreement is reached. A meeting in Brussels of EU leaders. I believe the President Zelensky himself is there, and the purpose of this meeting, supposedly, is to agree to a program to fund Ukraine for a further 2 years. And it is said that there are two proposals on the table. The proposal which the EU Commission prefers and which is backed by Germany and I assume France, which is the 140 billion euro loan using Russian assets held by Euroclear, frozen as a result of earlier EU sanctions packages going all the way back to February 2022. Anyway, to using those assets as collateral. The other plan is some other form of loan, which, as I understand it, will require some form of joint borrowing, joint liabilities for borrowing, which will be provided by EU member states, a model which to me sounds no different from the much talked about proposal for Eurobonds. Now, I think at this point, two things. One thing immediately needs to be said. Firstly, both of these proposals are on their face illegal. The proposal to float a loan using Russian assets as collateral without the agreement of Russia is, as I have said many times, illegal. Now, I understand the Financial Times is saying that a law firm called Covington, in fact, I've had information to this effect from Eve Smith as well, that a law firm called Covington has apparently advised the European Commission that there is nothing to fear at all from any legal action brought by Russia, that even if the EU proceeds with this loan plan, then there is scarcely any risk arising from Russian legal action arising from it, and this advice apparently discounts the danger that I've discussed in previous programs of a tribunal set up as a result of the commercial treaty between Russia and Belgium, that tribunal making a decision which would be enforceable in Europe or which would be enforced by third countries which trade with the EU. Well, that is a point of view. I set it out here. It is not mine. Obviously, there is a fundamental difference between whether or not the Russians would be able to win a case and whether or not they would be able to enforce it. There is always that issue in every legal case, in all legal proceedings. A judgment is one thing, enforcement of that judgment is another. But the very fact that so many EU countries have objected to this proposal, that the ECB, Euroclear itself, and apparently the IMF have argued against it, all of that suggests to me that the legal risks are much greater than Covington is saying, and that, for the record, is what I personally also believe. Anyway, presumably that Covington advice is circulating and is being provided to the EU leaders who are involved in this meeting. So far, according to the reports which I have heard, as of the making of this program, the skeptics don't seem to be very impressed. But De Wever, the Prime Minister of Belgium, continues to say that he wants absolute categorical guarantees from all of the other EU member states that they will cover Belgium's liabilities in the event that the Russians win their case and things begin to go seriously wrong for Belgium. So that is what Bart De Wever is saying. He clearly is aware of this Covington advice, but it seems that he's unconvinced by it. And as I've said already in previous programs, a procession of other EU countries are expressing their doubts about this proposal. Italy, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Belgium, Bulgaria, Malta, and Cyprus. And I believe that quietly, behind the scenes, there is skepticism, at the very least skepticism, maybe even reticent opposition from other countries too. One country in particular, I would not be surprised if it has its doubts about this, and that is Spain. Though I want to stress, I am not familiar with what stance the Spanish government itself is taking about this matter. Anyway, as of now, there is no news of any final decision between these two plans being made. I've discussed the potential, my own belief about the illegality of the first plan, the floating of the loan secured on on Russian assets. But in my opinion, the alternative plan, Eurobonds, is illegal as well. The European Union treaties apparently expressly prohibit Eurobonds. And certainly, as far as I can tell, they would prohibit Eurobonds for this specific purpose. Having said that, it is worth saying that the European Union has, in the past, floated Eurobonds. It did so briefly, as I seem to remember, during the pandemic. And they've already bent that law. Perhaps this time they will straightforwardly break it, just to say. So it is not impossible that we might get that decision too. But there is apparently an overwhelming consensus that money for Ukraine must be found. One or two countries, Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban, are saying that the moment has now come to stop providing Ukraine with money, that this is clearly a doomed enterprise, that Ukraine is clearly bankrupt, that there is no sense in providing Ukraine with money. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, is saying the same. But my sense is that these are outliers. Even Belgium is not objecting exactly to providing Ukraine with additional European funding. Rather, what Belgium objects to is providing Ukraine with another loan secured using the Russian assets in Euroclear as collateral. So ultimately, it seems to me that it boils down to a dispute between one or other of these two equally ill-starred plans. And it is not difficult to understand why there is this determination to provide Ukraine with this money. Because all of the reports say that Ukraine is rapidly running out of money. When I say all of the reports, there's even been an article in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, which always takes the most extreme optimistic spin that it is possible to take in relation to the situation in Ukraine. Optimistic, of course, from a Ukrainian point of view. Anyway, even the Daily Telegraph acknowledges that there is a huge hole in Ukraine's budget and that Ukraine cannot cover that hole based upon its own resources, and that it could quite easily face a major financial crisis if further EU funding were not provided. I would add as well to that of course the psychological effect in Ukraine, and by the way across Europe, if the Europeans were to stop providing funding to Ukraine, would be enormous. It would have catastrophic effect on whatever remains of Ukrainian morale. And, well, for all of these reasons, I cannot imagine that the European Union, so deeply invested in this project now, so trapped within the sunk costs fallacy which governs all its actions, is going to cut off Ukraine, leave it without funding at a time like this. So somewhere, some way or other, somehow or other, the money for Ukraine will come. Either the opposition from Belgium and the other states will be ground down over the course of the next couple of hours or days or whenever, and they will agree to provide Ukraine with a loan secured against the Russian assets, or they will go down the road of Euro bonds. But one way or the other, the money will be found. Now, having said that, it's important to say that this is wrong and illogical, however it is done, and whatever the legalities are. I've spent much time talking about the illegalities of these moves, but let us say that both of these moves were legal, or that it was possible to argue that these moves were legal with some reasonable confidence of success in a court of law. Let's just run with that for the moment. Ukraine is losing territory. It's losing ground in the war. I will come back to what Putin has said about the state of the war and what the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, has said about it also later in this program. But Ukraine is gradually losing ground. It is gradually losing territory. Its cities are being bombed every day. I understand that Odessa is in the 5th day of a blackout, and a state of emergency has just been declared in that city. So Ukraine is losing the war. Its economy is in effect shattered. It is its ability to raise money in taxes is shattered. It has no credibility on global financial markets. It would not be able to raise loans in global financial markets. Certainly not if there weren't a secure funding stream from Europe or the United States. And, well, and Ukraine already has a debt to GDP ratio above 100%, which is catastrophic for a country without deep savings. So, is it really wise? Is it remotely appropriate to lend money to a country that finds itself in that kind of position? Well, if you're using proper, objective financial criteria, if you are acting according to your duty to European taxpayers, if you're a European official or a leader of a European government, if you are a commercial bank or investment company, well, the first principle of lending in any one of these cases is that you do not lend money to someone who is already bankrupt. Yes, the IMF does it, but then the IMF supposedly does it in circumstances where it imposes stringent conditions on the borrower intended to bring the borrower back to solvency. This loan that is being proposed, or rather I should say these loans that are being proposed, are no such thing. There are no stringent conditions that I'm aware of attached to them. How can they be when the purpose of these loans is not to bring Ukraine back to solvency? It is to enable Ukraine to continue to fight a war. So, lending money is in effect giving away money that Ukraine cannot repay. And we can already see that from the structure of the EU loan that is now being proposed. Because if the EU is able to provide Ukraine with a loan of 140 billion euros secured against the Russian assets, Ukraine would get 100 billion euros from that loan. But the remaining 40 billion would be used to pay off a previous loan of 40 billion euros that the EU previously made to Ukraine and which Ukraine itself cannot repay. The EU, in other words, is giving more money to Ukraine, or to be more precise, it is lending more money to Ukraine in order that Ukraine can pay back previous loans that the EU made to it. Well, I won't say that I've never seen something like this happen before, but again, it is not usually considered prudent lending. Just saying. So, there we are. This is what apparently is being proposed, giving vast sums of money to Ukraine and doing so for no functional, no reasonable financial purpose, such as loans are normally provided for. Now, here I'm going to give two examples. There were the lend-lease loans that the United States gave to Britain and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But the United States didn't just hand over vast sums of money to these two countries, to Britain and the Soviet Union, calling them loans and then in effect writing them off. The US was absolutely determined to get security for these loans, and it did. The Soviets and the British gave the Americans significant liens on assets, and in the case of the Russians, they also provided the Americans with gold, and the British also were obliged to do so. They were obliged to transfer large amounts of gold to the United States during the Second World War. Even during the Second World War, American funding for these two countries, Britain and the Soviet Union, was not given for nothing. And of course, the United States was directly involved in that war. It was the ally of these two countries. There was, and after a certain point in the war, there was good reason to believe that the war would end in victory, and the war did eventually end in victory. And for the record, both Britain and the Soviet Union eventually were able to repay, and did repay, the lend-lease loans in full. Just saying. So that was what was done then. Now there is another lending that I am particularly familiar with, because of course it is part of the recent history of my own country, and here I'm talking about Greece, and that is the various loans that the European Union made to Greece during the sovereign debt crisis between 2011 and 2015. And the point about those loans is that the European Union did not just provide the money, but it administered the loans on the ground. I remember that EU officials at that time were present in all of the departments of all the Greek ministries, making sure that the funding as it arrived was used for the purpose that the EU said it should be used for. The presence of these EU officials, as I know, was deeply resented. I heard people in Greece at the time talking to me about a neo-colonial arrangement. I remember being told that very thing. But in a sense, you can understand why the EU creditors did that, because they wanted to make sure that their money was used properly. Well, let us look at what is being proposed now. Ukraine, which remember is not a formal ally of the EU, it's not an EU member state. It does have an association agreement with the EU, which, by the way, it was the starting point of the present crisis back in 2013. But I'm not going to revisit here that old history. Anyway, the Ukraine, which is not a military ally of the EU or of NATO, or a member of the European Union, is receiving huge amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, of euros rather, of money from the EU, and there is barely any accountability as far as I can see at all. Certainly, there's no word of Ukrainian assets being put forward as security for these loans. Donald Trump has tried to do that with his mineral rights extraction deal. That deal is, in a way, somewhat bizarre because, in effect, it's an attempt to obtain Ukrainian assets as security for past payments to Ukraine, which had already previously been made. Anyway, I'm not going to revisit the complex and tangled and, in my opinion, rather absurd story of the mineral rights extraction deal and all of that. But anyway, there is no attempt, as far as I'm aware, of the EU to obtain security from Ukraine for these loans by obtaining liens over Ukrainian assets. On the contrary, it is Russian assets that are supposed to provide the collateral. The United States did not demand, when it made lend-lease loans to Britain during the Second World War, that the British promised German assets as collateral for those loans, because, of course, the United States knew perfectly well that those assets were under German control. Just saying. At any rate, insofar as they were in Germany. But the European Union, instead of asking for security in the form of Ukrainian assets, even though Ukraine is the borrower, is apparently, well, is itself proposing that the security be provided by the assets that belong to someone else entirely, which is Russia, without the consent of that other person. So there is no legal, or at least no legally justifiable, as far as I'm concerned, security for these loans, and the Ukrainians are not offering security. And the Europeans are not seeking day-to-day active in-place supervision of these loans, the spending on these loans in Ukraine either, at least not as far as I am aware. And all of this, by the way, in the middle of a massive corruption scandal that is currently playing out in Kiev, which remains unresolved. So all of this is truly extraordinary. It is very bizarre. But as I've said previously, the determination in Europe remains that Ukraine will be provided with this money, that Zelensky will be provided with this money, and he will, of course, get it. Now, the other great irony here is that if the money is provided, it is not going to change the situation in Ukraine. There is a gathering consensus in Ukraine itself, rather on the part of some people in Ukraine, in Russia, obviously, but I believe also amongst some people in the United States, that the military situation in Ukraine has passed the tipping point, that the Russian advance from this point onwards is unstoppable, and that in a situation of military collapse, funding for the Ukrainian budget will fall still further. And putting aside the question of spending on, putting aside the question of tax revenue and how these loans are going to be spent, it is almost certain that Ukraine is going to run through this money very, very fast indeed, much faster than the 2 years that the Europeans are currently talking about. So the intention, the reason as I see it for setting this 2-year period, claiming that Ukraine is going to be fully covered for 2 years if this money is provided in this way, is because, of course, in 2 years' time, we're going to start getting closer and closer to the next presidential election in the United States. And the American commentator and writer, Gordon Hahn, who's one of the most intelligent analysts, both of the situation inside Russia and of the war itself that I know. Anyway, Gordon Hahn has argued that the entire plan ultimately of the Ukrainians and of the European Union is to try to keep Ukraine together for 2 or 3 more years until the next president of the United States comes into office and the Americans come back with their enormous checkbooks and resume writing out the checks. In other words, that this is really all about outlasting Donald Trump. And I am sure that up to a certain point, he is right. But the reality is that both because of the direction of the war and because of the direction of the Ukrainian economy, even if this 140 billion euros is provided, it will not be enough to take Ukraine through those full 2 years. Of that, I am absolutely sure. In fact, I would be surprised if this money gets Ukraine past next summer, assuming that Ukraine is still in the fight by then. Just saying. So anyway, that's the situation at the moment. It's all still under debate. The Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has said that everybody is in agreement, that there must be some decision as to how to finance Ukraine, but there are still many complex and technical issues to sort out. which is a way of saying that after the time when Donald Tusk was making his comments, which was about an hour ago, by the way, an hour before I started this program, that no agreement had so far been reached. An agreement will be reached, the money will be provided, it is almost certainly illegal, however it is done, and it makes no financial or commercial sense, and the people who will ultimately pay will be the taxpayers of Europe. Just saying. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this issue today. Now, yesterday, I touched on the fact that President Putin of Russia had made what seemed to me an uncompromising speech at the board of the ministry, the Russian Ministry of Defense, to which he spoke early yesterday. This was actually, as it turns out, an enormous meeting. And the lead speaker at this meeting was not Putin at all. It was the Russian Defense Minister, Belousov, whose speech must have lasted hours. It is interminably long if you obtain its full text, which, by the way, isn't easy. And he only discussed the situation in Ukraine in the area of the special military operation in part of his speech. And I'm going to say, first of all, that it was clear to me that the overriding purpose of this meeting in Moscow of the board of the Ministry of Defense was not so much to discuss and to analyze the situation in the area of the special military operation, but to talk about further and continuing major upgrades of the Russian armed forces. And this is being done at a time of growing budget discipline. Putin and his finance officials, the finance minister Siluanov and the central bank chair Elvira Nabiullina, have all decided that the budget of the Russian Defense Ministry has now reached enormous dimensions by Russian standards and must be reduced with the objective of achieving long-term financial discipline. So the big jump in defense spending that took place at the start of the special military operation has now ended, has now plateaued, and from this moment on, it will continue to fall. It will nonetheless remain at a much higher level than was the case before the special military operation started. And much of Belousov's speech was about using this money in order to improve the long-term resilience and ability of the Russian military in light of the potential for a future European war. And I have to say that I found the entire mood of this meeting extremely hardline and implacable. And its basic line was, yes, we are well aware of all of these commentaries and all of these discussions and all of these speeches that are being made by Western leaders, by European leaders, by Mark Rutte, Friedrich Merz, generals in Britain and France, prime ministers of various Western countries, Friedrichsen and others. We're well aware that they're talking about a war fairly soon with us. We have seen that some of them are talking about a potential war with us within the next few years, and about Europe needing to be prepared to wage such a war by some point between 2027 and 2030. And we have to take into account the possibility that a war of that kind might come. So we have to continue to improve and expand the size of our armed forces in preparation for just such a war. And most of Belarus's speech is about that. It's about new training systems, assimilating the lessons of the special military operation and disseminating them across the military, upgrading the military in all sorts of ways, improving the education of officers, improving the training systems, obviously supplying the military with all the necessary weapons. All of these things, all kinds of new weapons are coming into play as well, not just the ones we've been hearing about recently, the Oreshnik. Putin, by the way, said that the Oreshnik, which entered serial production earlier this year, and which was apparently provided for the first time to the troops in August of this year, that the Oreshnik is now coming into operation before the end of this year. In other words, this month. Anyway, but not just the Oreshnik, other weapon systems are also coming in. There was some reference, for example, to the S-500 air defense missile system. This is not apparently an upgrade of the S-400 system. It is a new system capable of shooting down warheads of certain types of intercontinental ballistic missiles. It is also apparently able to shoot down satellites in low Earth orbit. So anyway, all of systems like that. And of course, there was talk about the new weapons, the Poseidon, the Burevestnik, the new submarines that are coming, all of those things. But as I said, it was a speech about preparing for a future European war. I cannot express in words how dismayed all of that makes me. We are now in an arms race in Europe, and it's an arms race between the Europeans and the Russians. And despite all that is said many times about how much bigger European economies are than the Russian economy, I have no doubt whatsoever that in such an arms race the Russians will win. Or win is not perhaps the correct word, because what I expect will happen is that this arms build-up that the Russians are engaging in, which is the details of which have been spelled out in great detail, this build-up, I have no doubt, is going to happen. Whereas all of the talk about a military build-up in Europe is going to result in crushingly disappointing outcomes, because for the many reasons I have discussed many times, and which others like Brian Beletic have also discussed, the European economies are not in a position to sustain an arms build-up of that kind, and there are no plans, no actual plans to do so. So, what we are going to end up with in 2030 is with a situation in which the military balance in Europe is going to have shifted still further to the advantage of the Russians. In fact, the imbalance by that point, I suspect, is going to start to become lopsided. And, well, given how terrified some people in Europe already are by the growing power of the Russian military, it was interesting to say, by the way, that Belousov mentioned that already today Russia doesn't have the same army as the one with which it started the special military operation in 2022. Today's Russian army is much bigger, much stronger, far more professional, far better equipped, technologically an order of magnitude more advanced than it was 4 years ago. Anyway, given how alarmed people in Europe are by the build-up that the Russians have conducted already, what is the mood in Europe going to be when this build-up continues and gets much greater and the analogous build-up in Europe itself fails? Well, rationally, logically, we should try at that point to find a way back. We should try to speak to the Russians and see whether some kind of understandings can be reached to secure peace in Europe. But who expects that to happen? Well, not apparently Vladimir Putin. He spoke, as I said in my program yesterday, in rather chilly terms about a possible improvement in relations with the United States, though he was careful to say that there have so far been no substantive negotiations between the American and the Russian sides. But he also made it very clear, using at one point rather coarse language, that he does not believe that the leaders of Europe, the current leaders of Europe, are people with whom Russia can negotiate. In fact, his words were extremely crude, just to say, even if one allows for the gloss that some Russian speakers have placed on them. Anyway, put all that aside. Putin does not expect an improvement of relations with the Europeans anytime soon. He says that one day, when the present leaders are gone and replaced by others, some kind of dialogue might take place. Some people in Europe, in the media, spoke about Putin suggesting some kind of regime change in Europe. I don't believe that was his meaning at all. His real meaning is that unless things change at a leadership level in Europe, the Russians must be prepared for the reality that they are locked in an unending conflict with the Europeans, and that a build-up, and that is why this military build-up must take place. In which case, if he's right, and I'm afraid I think he is, what are we going to do when, as I said, the military balance shifts even further in Russia's favour? Well, I'm not going to try and anticipate what our leaders will do then, but I must say I cannot imagine that it will be anything wise or good. I suspect that the level of panic and fear-mongering and hysteria is going to reach levels which go beyond, perhaps even far beyond, the already very disturbed levels that we are seeing at present. Anyway, that was Belousov's speech. But Putin, as I discussed in my program yesterday, did make very clear again that he is in no mood to compromise, and that the Russians are in no mood to compromise over their conditions, the conditions that they set out at the start of the special military operation, and which he reiterated again with some additions when he spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June 2024. And the Russians clearly are aware of what came out of all of the discussions between the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians in Berlin, and they are not at all happy with what they are hearing. And, well, Putin essentially made that fact known. Now, on that point, I noticed that there is no hurry at the moment by Witkoff and Kushner to return to Moscow. Instead, and somewhat strangely, they are back in Miami, and rather than going to Moscow and facing Putin, confronting Putin with the Berlin proposals, they are awaiting instead Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, to come to them. And, well, that is interesting in itself, because it strongly suggests to me that Witkoff and Kushner understand perfectly well that the Russians are not going to like the Berlin proposals, and if they go to Moscow with them and present them to Putin, he will reject them flat out. Could it be that they've invited Dmitriev to Miami to try to either persuade him, to persuade his boss to accept the proposals? If that's the case, then they're going to be disappointed, because I cannot imagine that Dmitriev is going to have that kind of sway on Putin, even assuming that he wants to. Or could it be that Witkoff and Kushner know perfectly well that what has come out of Berlin, the security guarantees for Ukraine, analogous to Article 5, the 800,000-man Ukrainian army equipped to the highest level with Western weapons, the deployment of European forces in Western Ukraine. They know perfectly well that all of that is unacceptable to the Russians. They know perfectly well that the Russians are going to find it even less acceptable, given that Zelensky is not even prepared to withdraw from Donbass, from what parts of Donbass the Ukrainians still control. They know that, and rather than go with the Berlin proposals to Moscow and have them rejected there, they are intending to renegotiate them all over again with Dmitriev in Miami. And notice that the chief Ukrainian negotiator, Rustem Umerov, is apparently also going to be floating around Miami. Presumably, he is continuing to meet the FBI, and one wonders why and what about. Massive speculation about this in Ukraine. Lots of discussions that he's trying to get American protection in light of the corruption scandal in which he is allegedly implicated. I'm not going to waste time trying to analyze that. Anyway, could it be that the American plan, or to be more precise, the Witkoff-Kushner plan, is to talk through with Dmitriev the Berlin proposals, get Dmitriev's confirmation that Putin won't accept them, have them watered down, brought back to something fairly much closer to the original 28 points, and then to speak to Umerov and to tell Umerov, look, we've now talked about this with the Russians and they are simply not buying it. So, yes, we made a big effort to meet you more than halfway in Berlin, but if there's going to be peace, if there's going to be a settlement, this isn't going to work. Well, if I am right about this, then we are obviously and plainly still in negotiations that are going round in circles, because, well, there is little point in that case in going to Berlin, agreeing one thing with the Ukrainians, and then speaking to the Russians and taking it all back, and then going back again to the Ukrainians. As I said, the strange way in which this negotiation is being conducted, I think, baffles practically everyone outside the administration itself. Anyway, let's return to this. Let's return to Putin, because ultimately this is much more important than whatever weird things happen in Miami. Putin, as I said, came across to me as completely uncompromising. And again, I think it is Gordon Hahn who has described the state of things best. Gordon Hahn has a Substack blog, a Substack page, rather, I should say, and he's put it like this: the Berlin draft, watered down from Trump's 28-point plan, provides no guarantee that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. It rejects the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the 4 regions Russia's constitution now stipulates as Russian sovereign territory, and it holds for an 800,000 strong Ukrainian army. These points contradict Russia's 3 key conditions for a treaty. First, a legally codified guarantee of no NATO expansion to Ukraine and no NATO forces in Ukraine, not an American promise, which is not worth the paper it is written on. Second is the incorporation into Russia of all the territories of the 4 regions stipulated in the constitution as Russian. The long discussed but never made Russian compromise that Moscow would accept a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson, thereby ceding them at least temporarily to Kiev, was never in play. He is absolutely right about this. Third, Russia is unlikely to accept a post-war Ukrainian army larger than 300,000 men and will likely insist on something on the order of 200,000 men. For the record, in Istanbul in April 2022, they insisted on around 80,000 men. Just saying. And then he continues by saying that what the Europeans are trying to do is to buy time, to try to spin this out for as long as they can, in order to wait Trump out and to get a new US president who will revert to the Biden policies. But again, Gordon Hahn sets out the obvious problem. Time is not on Kiev's side and is rapidly running out for the Ukrainian army, which is unlikely to last the peace and election processes. The Ukrainian army is weakening whilst the Russian army is gaining strength. Soon Russian forces will have taken all the territories in the 4 regions it demands. Moreover, Russian forces are advancing in Kharkiv, Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk regions, and Kiev only has half of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions to trade to get those areas back as of now, and will have less in the coming months. In sum, in the face of constant retreat of its forces, Kiev's resistance to territorial concessions is a loser's position, and it will become more so at an accelerating pace. And Gordon Hahn is right. Now, let's go back to what happened at this meeting in the Russian Ministry of Defense's board. Well, Belousov gave an overview of the state of the war. He spoke about how the Russian army continues to advance. He repeated, by the way, the Russian claim that the Russians are in complete control of Kupiansk. He spoke about how the Russians are advancing in Gulyapolye and in Konstantinovka, and how the Mirnograd operation is coming close to an end, and how the Russians are also advancing in the north. Putin himself weighed in. He said that the Ukrainian army is collapsing. This on the basis of Belousov's claims about the scale of Ukrainian losses and Ukraine's inability to make those losses up. According to Belousov, and by the way, other reports that I've heard, this year, 2025, has been the heaviest year for Ukrainian losses up to now in this war, just to say. So, anyway, that was what Belousov said. And Putin, for his part, said that before long, or rather he said that the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian state, is already in a visible process of deterioration, of degradation. The overall sense I got from this whole series of speeches at this meeting, but especially perhaps from Putin's speech, is that Putin believes that the war is almost won. There is still quite a lot of fighting to do. The Ukrainians still are resisting, but their strength is ebbing away. 3 years of attrition have taken a terrible toll, and that a collapse is just over the horizon. Belousov, incidentally, also said that in Donbass at least, the Russians expect to be in complete control of Donbass within a proximate period as part of the remaining campaign, and it's fairly clear that the Russians expect to be in full control of Donbass by some point in 2026. So, given that this is the view that Putin has, and I am quite certain that this is his view, I don't think he is in any mood to make concessions or to make compromises, and I don't think he has any intention of doing so. Why would he give his victory away, his coming victory away? And of course, beyond that, if the Russians do fear that there is a real possibility of war between them and Europe, or of war between them and the West at some point around 2030, that will make it even more important, I would have thought, for the Russians to achieve all of their objectives in Ukraine and to neutralize Ukraine as a potential threat to them in case after 2030 they do find themselves in such a war. In that respect, all of this rhetoric that has been coming out of Europe over the last few weeks about a potential march west by the Russians, all that it will have probably done is harden the determination of the Russians to achieve a complete military victory in Ukraine. So that, I think, is the Russian position. Now, it ought to be said that there are alternative views. Seymour Hersh continues to get information from his sources who tell him that the Russians are apparently prepared to sign on the dotted line to all of Donald Trump's Berlin plan. This is all based on the belief that the Russian army is supposedly falling apart and that the strains in the Russian economy are growing out of control. I don't know where the sources of Seymour Hersh get their information from, but there is absolutely nothing that I have seen in any part of the Russian media, both the official media and what might be described as the unofficial media, that bear any of that out. But I suspect that it continues to be a common view in the West. My own view, on the contrary, is that the best way to approach what the Russians are thinking And what they're going to do is to go to what they themselves say. And as I said, the message that came out of this Defense Ministry board meeting in Moscow was an implacable one. Now, that then, I suppose, must bring me back to a quick discussion of the military situation in Ukraine. And there has been more news over the last 24 hours. It seems that the Russians have made further progress in Zaporozhye region. As I said here, they appear to be unstoppable. And it also looks as if the Russians have made some further progress in the Seversk-Liman area, where I suspect progress is going to be slower. There continue to be the various conflicting claims about the situation in Kupiansk, and the Ukrainians continue to claim that they're making big advances there, even though I've noticed again the dearth of any actual videos that confirm this. By contrast, I've noticed that over the last couple of hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has started to publish a lot more of information about what is taking place in and around Kupiansk. And I would say that, in summary, I have no doubt that the Russians are confident that they will hold on to the town. And whether there is actually a genuine Ukrainian offensive going on there, or how successful that is, there is no doubt at all in my mind that the Russians intend and expect to retain full control over that town. The commentaries that I'm seeing on the Russian Defense Ministry website, most of which are anecdotal, but leave, to my mind, no doubt at all about this. The most important news, from what I can see, comes from Mirnograd, where Redovka has provided its own account of the military situation. And Redovka says that the Ukrainian forces in Mirnograd have now been reduced to a cluster of isolated pockets, that organized resistance in Mirnograd has ended, and that at some point soon all resistance will have ended entirely. There's quite a detailed report from Redovka, and it spoke about individual buildings, identified individual buildings in the town which the Ukrainians still holding, particularly positions on the Redovka mine, on the Dimitrov mine. Obviously, the fact that you're getting a lot of detail doesn't necessarily prove that that detail is true, just to say. But anyway, it was an interesting and very circumstantially detailed report. And for the record, I believe it. I don't get the sense that the Russians are losing steam. I don't get the sense that their offensive is going to stop. I read, I think it was in The Economist, that the Ukrainians are telling their friends in the West that they expect the Russian offensive to run out of steam sometime around February. What generally happens, what happened last year, is that in February, after a continuous advance of many months, the Russians do stop to refit and reorganize and to replace losses and to stock up on equipment. But this is always done in preparation for further advances. This is what happened last year, and even, or rather this year, and even in February 24, the pace of the Russian advance reduced, but it never stopped entirely, just to say. So that is my own view about the military situation, and I suspect that, as I said, within the next week, maybe, we will hear about the fall of Mirnograd and probably about the fall of Gulyapolye. And according to Belousov, there is fighting going on in Liman, and maybe that place will also fall under Russian control before long too. Now, before I finish the program, there are two further things I do want to discuss briefly. One is an article, or rather a speech, that has been made by the new British MI6 chief, Blaise Mercouris. Now, I have not been able to find the full text of this speech. I am obtaining it entirely from second-hand sources. I know that the speech took a very, very implacable line against Russia, identifying Russia as the major threat to Britain. But it also contained a section in which Mercouris apparently referred to the actions of SOE, the Special Operations Executive, the James Bond type organization that the British set up during the Second World War, and which was involved in all kinds of sabotage activities throughout the Second World War in German-occupied Europe. She said, "We will sharpen our edge and impact with audacity, tapping into, if you like, our historical SOE instincts." Now, I've already discussed in many programs how the Russians invariably claim, whenever the Ukrainians conduct some kind of James Bond type operation on Russian territory, like blowing up trains, assassinating Russian officers, or launching drones into Russian strategic bomber bases, the Russians always point the finger at London. They say that it's the British who are playing a significant role in this. And I have said many times that I personally don't know that this is so, and I've always felt that the Russians anyway have a tendency to attribute always all of these things to the British, and that it did seem to me at time that the Russians, in terms of all this type of James Bond activity, are somewhat British obsessed. Well, here we have no less a person than the head of MI6 talking about the British undertaking operations, admittedly in the future, drawing upon their historical SOE instincts. The Russians, I am sure, are going to read those words as confirmation that the British have been involved in this dirty war all along. I think for that reason alone, this was a mistaken thing for Blaise Mercouris to say. Of course, it could be that the Russians are right, and based on what Blaise Mercouris is saying, even if they aren't right now, it looks as if MI6 is going to make them right in the future. I have already spoken about my own deep unhappiness about this thing, the extent to which I deeply dislike the idea of Britain, my country, becoming involved in a dirty war, especially against such a much mightier adversary than we ourselves are, which is Russia. But it looks as if that is precisely what we're going to do. And of course the Russians will take countermeasures. Of course, in fairness to Mercouris, she claims that the British are going to do this in response to things that the Russians are already doing. Even if that is so, I still think that this is a huge mistake. And what exactly are these things which the Russians have done in Britain, these operations, these dirty war operations that the Russians have done in Britain up to now, which have anyway done us so much harm? I am not aware of any, just to say. There's been, I think, 2 attempted assassinations attributed to the Russians. And in all real terms, that's been about it. Now, if we really do get ourselves catapulted into a dirty war, that could very easily change. And it's always important to say that 2 can always play this game. And in playing a game like this against the Russians, we are anyway always going to be outmatched. But perhaps the other thing to say is, do dirty wars, do doing things like this ever work in the end? My own knowledge of what SOE actually achieved during the Second World War is that all its many operations made no difference to the outcome of the war at all. That the war was won, not by SOE and all its various James Bond antics across Europe. All that those did was get an awful lot of people, including sometimes innocent people, killed to no purpose. The war, the Second World War, was won on the battlefields, mostly, it must be said, by the Red Army. So we're going to end up involving ourselves in things of this kind, in drawing upon a precedent, what SOE did in the past, which was unsuccessful. But there is something else. Is this not at least perhaps a foretaste of things to come? Might it be the case, and I say might because I don't know exactly what Mercouris said, and I certainly don't know what is being discussed in MI6, but might it be the case that MI6 is aware that the war in Ukraine is indeed almost lost, and that they're now looking to plan B, which is to try to run the insurgency inside Ukraine against the Russians? After all, wasn't that what SOE was doing? Trying to inflame resistance to the Germans in German-occupied Europe. So MI6 might be thinking of running the same kind of operation in Russian-occupied Ukraine. I think that would be an absolute disaster. I think if we tried to do that, more likely than not, we would be blamed by everybody who was on the receiving end for what had happened. And obviously, it would destroy the relationship between Britain and Russia completely. Well, I hope that the snippets of details of Mercouris' speech that I have seen, I have understood wrongly. But she did mention SOE. She did talk about MI6 adopting those instincts. And, well, I have to say, all of that fills me with concern and doubt. The second thing I want to briefly mention is that there's a very interesting article in Reuters which talks about how the enormous progress that China has made in developing its own ultraviolet lithography machines. It says that in Shenzhen, Chinese scientists have built what Washington has spent years trying to prevent, a prototype of a machine capable of producing the cutting-edge semiconductor chips that power artificial intelligence, smartphones, and weapons central to Western military dominance. Completed in early 2025 and undergoing testing, the prototype fills nearly an entire factory floor. It was built by a team of former engineers from Dutch semiconductor giant ASML, who reverse engineered the company's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, according to two people with knowledge of the project, who I'm sure are intelligence officers. So China has produced its first prototype EUV machine. And we're told that there are still problems, that the Chinese have not so far been able to duplicate the very advanced mirrors that are produced by Carl Zeiss and which ASML uses in its machines. But there is no doubt that they will. There's some suggestions that the Chinese will be mass producing chips, the most advanced chips, by 2028. That's apparently what the Chinese are saying. Others put it to 2030, but there is no doubt that before long it will be done. And of course the Chinese can already produce very advanced chips by themselves, these very, very advanced chips by themselves, using older machines. This is, I think, now widely understood. The only thing is that they can't produce them in quite the same quantities as Taiwan, the Taiwan forges are able to do. Now, I'm just going to say something quickly here. I suspect that the Chinese will have mastered the optics a lot sooner than anybody in the West imagines. The idea that China cannot match Carl Zeiss in optics seems to me a fantastic one. Nothing about this surprises me. And for the record, I believe that the Russians are obviously working with far more limited resources, but that they are not so far behind. It's said that the Chinese machine is much bigger than the ASML machines. It is, after all, a prototype. But already the West, the Americans, are alarmed at the speed with which the Chinese are replicating this technology. The West is in a technological race of its own making, and it is one in which the other side has the advantage of scale. This was always an ill-informed and foolish race to get drawn into, and for the record, by the mid-2030s, I expect China to be dominating the market in the most advanced chips. Anyway, that's where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, and also Substack. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.